Hi everyone, Joel here. Just wanted to give you an update. On this episode, we had some audio quality problems in the early going, but they tend to straighten themselves out a little bit later in the episode, so if you can kind of work your way through them, we appreciate that. Also, just wanted to let you know that we are looking at getting back into the studio in the near future, so bear with us as we work through this difficult time, and we look forward to giving you a high quality product in the near future again. Thanks for listening.
Mystery searching, finding all the things we knew were hiding. And this revelation only opens up more questions.
Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education. With me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. We've talked on the show in the past about the nature of reality and its implications. Today we'll talk about what informs many of those beliefs about reality, namely our perspective. We are habituated to thinking of perspective as merely a point of view, something subjectively relevant, but ultimately having no effect on the objective world. While sometimes this may seem to be the case, perspective has the potential to be much more powerful than this, with the ability to change history and perhaps even reality itself. All right, so we have recorded an episode on perspective before, and it didn't pan out. And we've had some technical difficulties in the early going here before we started the recording. So hopefully we'll make it through it and we'll have something for people. Otherwise, maybe we'll try it a third time a few months from now or something. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. We won't give up on this.
It's too cool of a topic. But it's been long enough. I think it was about a year ago that we did it, that some of the stuff I was going back and I go, okay, I remember talking about some of it, but some of it I thought, well, there's other things to explore here. So one of our loyal listeners said, hey, you mentioned in another episode that you did an episode on perspective and you were going to go back and do it again. So did you forget about it? And I said, yeah.
Isn't that cool that we have loyal listeners? What a humbling thing. How cool.
Let's dive into it. Perspective, it's kind of a point of view. What separates perspective from a point of view or perception?
I think that's really interesting because perception suggests, is about percepts, which are experiences of things, objects outside of ourselves, or things that are outside of ourselves. And perspective, in the sense, there's a relationship, because in the arts, perspective was developed architecturally and in painting and so on to project a realistic taking in awareness of the geometric space of the world around oneself. But perspective from the viewpoint, viewpoint is even perspective. It's exactly the kind of wording. Perspective suggests an already set collection of or cluster of assumptions or experiences that cause one to see things or to take them in a certain way. So perspective suggests a canting, a tipping, or a view into something.
Okay. So a perception is kind of, how we receive some information, and then a perspective is sort of how we're utilizing or integrating that information and what sort of meaning we're making out of it.
Yes, the meaning, the hermeneutics, the interpretative, the interpretations that we make. Yeah.
So, does perspective obviously has limitations, right? Where you're seeing the point of view, right? We have a point of view. So you're taking information and then you're ascribing characteristics to what it is that you're perceiving.
Yes.
So it's kind of a two-way street. You're not merely receiving information of things as they are, but you're receiving information and then you are assigning characteristics or values to what you're receiving.
Yes, and this is, you've just landed on the foundational, the nexus point, really, of how this connects the arts, theater, ordinary experiences, because, among other things, where you sit, whether metaphorically or literally, not talking about an audience, for instance, in the theater, but where you are determines what you are able to see. And you certainly know that from all of your not just your military training, but the work that you do. You can look at a product any number of ways, and it can appear differently depending on how it is presented. A perspective. Well, jump to theater for a moment. The interpretation of the dramaturgy that goes into trying to adequately and creatively find and make what a play is about. You have to start with the essence, which is, what is it that the playwright has given us in a set of lines, or what does a character say, and what are the stage directions for what the character does. So ultimately what you're looking at is what actually happens on the stage. What is the given that an audience will perceive, or that a reader of a script will perceive? And then how would an actor and a director working together make something? Where's the freedom of interpretation within a stage direction? For instance, a direction says the character yawns. Okay, Chekhov does this a lot. But how many different ways can one yawn? And that depends on what's being said around one that would cause one to respond. And so I like the theater example just as a start, because I think it gives us a way in.
Yeah, and that really does cross over to almost any kind of fields, right? We have issues with like this all the time where I work, where you have a quality policy, right? And the quality policy calls out defects. Okay, you're allowed to have a gouge that's this deep, or you're allowed to have this sort of mark, this sort of thing. And that seems very empirically set. But then as you come across instances of things in real life, even if you have these hard and fast, that doesn't mean that things fall into them hard and fast. All of a sudden well, is this a gouge, or is this a blister, or is it,
Yes. Yeah.
At what point it falls exactly on that 130 seconds mark? Does that make it good or bad? Or, and what you realize is that it doesn't matter what your empirical guidelines are. There's a subjective judgment rendered on all. There's no way around it. You can put it on the most finely tuned instrument and look at it, but when it comes down to it, it's still the person making the decision whether or not it meets the. And that's a business example. But the example you had of theater is great, and the same thing happens with all the other kinds of arts and things. Music, orchestras are arranged the way they are because the ability to record individual instruments and stuff, you wanted to set up the instruments around the room in order to give you the best mix of music. And then seats down over in the audience, develop certain positive characteristics because of how certain sounds reach the ear. It's still the same music being played at the same volume, all this different stuff, but just the placement of people really changes how you. So yeah, there's that point of view, that perspective. It really shows that how we make sense of the world is highly subjective, even in very what we'd consider objective situations. If you're presented with something that appears to be very concrete or literal, what you realize very quickly is that people will interpret it in very different ways.
Yeah.
So if we had, let's have a hypothetical, right? If we had an instrument or a series of instruments that was able to, pick up on every aspect of what we consider reality. You can see all of the electromagnetic spectrum, all of the the frequency ranges, all these different things. It could read thoughts, all this stuff. Would that machine have a lock on reality, or would there still be something missing?
Well, first, we don't know exactly how many levels of reality there are. I mean, if we have the electromagnetic spectrum, as you say, but there may well be other levels that we aren't able to perceive yet. So it would probably be arrogant of us to say, yep, and once we have a machine that does that, we can see everything. I would be very hesitant about that. So you are seeing more of the layers of an integrative reality with such a machine in prospect, but probably not everything, though.
So here's where that gets interesting then, right? Because if let's say that, I think that that's a reasonable thing to say, right? Okay, so let's say we had all of the instruments that we needed. We could read everybody's mind. We could see all of the different levels of light and sound and all the different things, even stuff that humans aren't aware of, right? The stuff that's beyond our perception. Somehow we had all these instruments so that we could perceive it all and we could look at it objectively. I'll put in quotations.
Okay.
If we are to determine then that isn't really going to be reality, then I think what we're getting into is saying, well, is there a singular reality then, right? And this is kind of a staple of the philosophical thought of perspective.
Yes.
Is so, well, if we had all these tools, could we actually know reality? Or even if we had all these tools, would there be different realities for different people or different parts of the universe or different spaces in time? Would there be one reality, or would there be a different reality depending on where you are?
Well, objectively, there might be one reality that we are peaking in the sense of the sum total of all possible radiation, electromagnetics, everything that resonates in the universe. To me, that the problem that raises, and you're getting at it here, is as much as to say this: if I can see everything all at once, then what am I going to choose to focus on? And what I choose to focus on is the partial reality of the moment. I mean, if suppose I'm presented with this enormous painting And somehow we've got a tool that can project that painting in its entirety into my mind without me having to look all around, and it's just all there. Or suppose I could stand out in space and actually get a 360 view, perhaps in a gaming sense or in virtual reality. Just because I can see all the stars and all the different colors of the stars, I may be overwhelmed by that emotionally. But what am I trying to do with that perception? I think that becomes the perspective is it implies an intentional thing.
Yeah. So, we're looking at. I think that you're exactly right. And again, this comes back to our other examples, right? Art is a great one. I remember painting something one time, and my dad, who's a really good artist, saying, "This is a good painting." And he said, the reason it's a good painting is because you have different objects of focus at different points. He said, you did this in painting and say, here, look at this. He said, because that's not what a good painting's about. Good painting makes you want to look over here and then go back up to the top and look again and see different things. And music is the same way. When I record stuff, that's the art of it. Is if you try recording something and making everything sound realistic, what happens is it gets very muddied and kind of smeared. So what you have to do is make artistic decisions about what's important. So if you're recording a guitar, like an acoustic guitar, right? If I wanted to make that guitar sound through the speakers like it sounds in the room, I could do that. But if I put it in the context of a mix, it would suddenly become this boxy, muddy thing. So what you have to do is you have to cut out a lot of the low end where the bass guitar or the bass drum sits. You have to cut out some of the high end where it conflicts with the vocal and stuff. And what you realize is that a lot of normal people don't do this, but if you listen to a song and you really focus in on one element, like an acoustic guitar, what you realize is there's very little of it that sounds like an acoustic guitar in real life does. Mm-hmm. But it's this amalgamation of sounds together that creates this feeling of realism. And that's kind of how reality works in general. You just said two things came to mind with which you were just articulating so well. And one of them is also from a Chekhov play. In a play called The Cherry Orchard, there's a moment when a guitar string snaps. And it's indicative of tension. It all resonates with symbolism in various ways and import to the story. But a director has to work really hard to make sure that you don't overwhelm everybody with like that string just taking over the entire scene. But it can't be so subtle that people barely perceive it, and it doesn't really make it smart. My art teacher has taught me the liberating moment for me in my art development has been to pay attention to this lesson over and over, which is draw or paint what you see, not what you know is there. And this is particularly true of things as seemingly simple as hands. One wants to draw all the details of a hand, but most often we do not see the details of a hand if you're working from a photograph or from a model. The hand is hidden, or the hand is in cloth, or those kind of things. So sometimes it looks more like a claw or a hook or a suggestion. We know it's a hand, and therefore we know that it conveys the humanity, but it's not what we know is there. It's what we're looking. It's what we see, which suggests both a concentration of observational acuity without trying to embellish because we think we know the rest. Right. Yeah, and it's surprising how few lines or brush strokes you need to communicate an idea to people. You see that a lot, which leads into another question, which is, so far we've talked quite a bit about perspective from a human point of view, which obviously is very important. But an equally important question is, do you need to be conscious to have a perspective or a point of view? So coming back to our first question there, if we have all these instruments, right, that detect every part of reality, let's say there's an AI in charge of it, right? So the AI is coordinating all these instruments. It sees every part of reality. Now, whether or not the AI is conscious is a completely different argument, but it's definitely not human. So does that AI, does it have a perspective or a point of view, or is it merely interpreting information?
I would say it's interpreting information and building algorithmically a sense of what various humans might prefer or might privilege, and so it might try to integrate those into a whole, but it's more likely to say, well, if you are interested in X, then here are 3 examples that I want you to look at. If you're interested in Y, then here are 3 other examples I want you to look at. I think that's the way it would go if artificial intelligence works its way up to the HAL 9000 level, or Skynet, or whatever we want to talk about with the terminal aspects of AI. But it's if you have a viewpoint, if you have complete access to everything, and not just access, but active, dynamic interplay with all of those things. AIs are still developed by humans. There's still going to be some pre-built perspective, I think, in it.
Yeah, that's we're already kind of there in a sense, because you see, if you look at how AI has been progressing in recent times, what you see is that it is making advances over humans in some regards, and it's lagging behind in others. So, like those decisions I was talking about with my work, like a quality sort of decision, it seems to be surpassing humans in that regard. There's a lot of medical evidence of it, catching cancer signs much earlier, much more accurately, those sorts of things than people do. But when it comes to other aspects like writing a play or a song or these sorts of things, it happens to me probably on a weekly basis where, Google News knows I'm interested in this sort of thing. So it's constantly throwing up articles. Hey, AI writes the next best musical hit. So I click on it and I listen to it. And I go, this is garbage. It's like, it's not that but that's the thing, is not that it's garbage. It's using, like you said, it's using the information to try to spit out something that it thinks humans will like. And as it does, it has elements that do appeal to people, but it seems like a disjointed, disconnected sort of thing that doesn't really make sense.
It's an infinitude. It's the poet William Blake, very spiritual, ethereal poet, a person of much accomplishment, but long ago. But he says, if the doors of perception are cleansed, which is what we're talking about with this kind of AI thing, everything would appear to be infinite, and we aren't wired to just take in the infinite at every moment. It would blow our minds. So, yes, I think AI, you're right about the medical, is making steps forward because it can collate or concatenate information and do it much faster and see things at a much more, not quantum level, maybe entirely, but certainly a microscopic level. And so that's all very useful. but it is essentially seeing what we would see, but with much better eyes and a much faster pace.
Right. What about animals? Do you think animals, do they just perceive or do they have perspective?
Oh, there's a question, because we keep coming back to animals from time to time, language and those kind of things.
I'll give you some background before you answer, because
please,
because you don't know what I'm thinking. You don't have my perspective.
No.
But so I read a book. It's one of the most interesting books I've ever read. I go through it occasionally. The Origins of Consciousness and the Rise of the Bicameral Mind, which talks about, it's a science informed sort of postulation on how consciousness developed in human beings. And basically what it says is, until about, a few thousand years ago, human beings weren't actually conscious. They had all of the same, mental faculties and things, but there was just some connections in the brain that hadn't quite been made yet. So they act in a very animalistic way. And how that's sort of manifested, if you were to put yourself in the shoes of a human from that long ago, was you'd have immediate perception. You could see and hear and do those things. But there was no metacognition. There was no self-reflection. There was just the voice of the gods speaking to you, telling you what to do. And of course, the voice of the gods was not actually the voice of the gods. It was, part of your brain. Before these connections have been made, before you could self-reflect or
You're
think
talking about
about
Julian Jaynes. You're talking about the Julian Jaynes book. Yes, I've read this. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So without the ability to self-reflect or to have metacognition and think about thinking, you could still think, but you couldn't think about thinking. So you could perceive, you could go around, you could do things, but you had this voice of the gods telling you what to do. And you look at ancient literature, and that's the way a lot of it's written is, okay, well, God or this God or, somebody spoke to me and then I did this thing,
Mm-hmm.
And so, and in his so that kind of connects back to the animals, right? He's thinking that, okay, this is probably how animals think, not with the voice of the gods sort of thing, but they live in the moment. They perceive through sight and sound and things, but they can't think about their own perspective. They can't think about thinking. They just operate.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one part of it. And now the other part escaped me. I had it right before I started talking, and now it's gone.
And it's important that you laid all that up. So but back to the question, and maybe this will stir it up with you. Do animals have perspective, or do they just perceive? Is that essentially what you were asking?
Yeah.
Well, and if we follow what you're taking from Jaynes, I think the only perspective argument might be in the construction of their visual apparatus. Not all creatures don't all have visual apparatus, but so there are limits to that. But how they hear or how they sense things through the physical apparatus is itself a kind of limiting perspective. Which is, I guess what I'm trying to say roughly is that, well, my cat is sitting behind me and my constant companion. Cats see differently than we do. We've had enough simulations from the research to know this. How a horse sees, so the limits of the eyesight of the horse, for instance, whether there's color or not. Now, these things may seem alien to us. They aren't going to be alien to the animal because it's all the animal knows. And
I remember the other part of it now, which was I watched an interesting documentary last week on, I think it was The Cradle of the Earth, as it was called. It was a documentation of all of the human species that have lived throughout history. So it goes through them all. And it was the last one, is the Neanderthal. And they talk about how, okay, Neanderthals, we used to think that they were pretty much apes, but it turns out they had brains much bigger than ours. They had the ability to speak. They formed small cultures and things. But what's interesting about it, so, they were asking, like, how did Neanderthals die out, but humans survived? Neanderthals were much more physically robust. They lived in communities. They had bigger brains than humans. How did humans manage to outlive the Neanderthals? And one thing that was super fascinating to me was that they showed tools, spearheads from humans and Neanderthals over the course of like 10,000 years or something. And so you see the first Neanderthal spearhead, and it's just this rough wooden, or, this rough chiseled stone. And you see the humans, and it looks just the same. And then a few years later, the Neanderthals looks the same, and the humans has gotten slightly sharper. Then you see a few years later, the Neanderthals looks the same, and the humans has gotten sharper and serrated, and so they go through the whole history of it. And you see the human technology continue to advance and adapt and get better. And the Neanderthal stays essentially the same throughout its entire history. And they said, okay, well, yeah, the Neanderthal had the bigger brain, but really the parts of the brain that were bigger were focused on perception. So they had much higher visual acuity. They had basically, they were able to perceive the world much more accurately than we are. Mm-hmm. But the frontal lobe, the part of it that does the thinking about thinking, that does the social integration, these sorts of things, they didn't have part of. So, kind of combining that with our animal discussion, what about Neanderthals? Did they have a perspective as a human species, or were even they just kind of perceiving the world and going about doing their thing? And then when that didn't work, rather than adapting, they died out as well. Where do we draw that line between perceiving and perspective, having a perspective?
It's messy, because I think one would say the Neanderthals did have a perspective. Whether we're talking individual or we're talking collective, that's important to keep in mind. But let's say either one we want to go with, because the hardware, so to speak, of the brain is the mind is wired to take in visually acute or sensually acute information. They're seeing the world differently than we have the capacity to see. So that is arguably a perspective. And this is where it mushes for me with perception. If you live on a mountain, you've never left the mountain, you've never been in a valley, then your perspective on the world is being trained, I would argue, even psychologically, to see the broader view. So the circumstances might determine the perspective. Well, the physical circumstances of any being partly just determines how that being looks into the world. Human beings can change, or some of us have the capacity. We all have the capacity to change. Whether we embrace that or not is always a question of the moment. But so perspective can change if you have the capacity through the frontal lobe to be able to do that. Unchanging perspective doesn't mean a perspective doesn't exist. It just means that it's locked in.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's a good explanation. And an interesting part of that was that, they sort of traced the extinction of the Neanderthals, right? So they followed where these last groups kind of went, and they ended up in some caves near Gibraltar. And what they found is that in these caves where the Neanderthals eventually kind of died out, you saw the first Neanderthal art. So they actually carved some things into the rocks and stuff. And they said they'd never seen this at any other site at any other point in their history. But all of a sudden at the end, they did it. And they had this really kind of cool segment on, what were they trying to say with these marks? Was it, what was their perspective on the world now that their species had died out and had been replaced by these other things,
That's
And so again,
profoundly serious.
yeah. And that gets into, this idea of where does, the perception end and perspective start. But I think that you point out a good, you put it pretty well, which is that they're not mutually exclusive. Even if you can't change your perspective, it doesn't mean that the one doesn't exist. But that's always been something that's fascinated me, is looking at the last individuals of certain species. It's sad, but it does make you wonder, what are they thinking when
Right.
they're all alone like that?
You're making me think of there's a writer that I used to enjoy in college named Anais Nin, and among other things, said that the purpose of art, and you're talking about these Neanderthal markings as a shaping as a kind of art, is to renew or refresh our perceptions, because when we get so familiar with something, we don't see it anymore, and only by seeing something freshly can we change. And what you just said, when you say that about the Neanderthals, I'm thinking how profoundly evocative and yet sad that perhaps at the end of their existence they were beginning to develop the very thing that would have continued their existence. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like one of those moments where, and then then it's too
Right.
late. Like
And
you
then
come to
that's-
the answer, but it's too late.
Yeah, and that's the end of it. And I think that says something about human perspective as well, and what the importance of storytelling to us, right? Because we've talked about the importance of stories
Yes.
recently. But I think that perspective gets ingrained into us, and then we start letting that warp our realities, because we have this idea of how a storyline should go and where things should develop. But the truth of the matter is that reality can be harsh like that, where, okay, you have a species, you're successful, and then you die out, and then at the end you find the thing that could have saved it, but it's too late. It doesn't matter. But
Yes.
there's also the part of the story where, you look at it and you say, okay, well, most living humans alive have 2 to 4% of their DNA from Neanderthals. And there's a lot of evidence that DNA serves an important purpose in your immune system and in, some of the other aspects.
Mhm.
And so in a way, they sort of do live on. And that raises the question of what it means to be human and all kinds of other stuff.
It
that
does.
you can't,
Out it goes. Out it balloons. It's
Right. It's too big for us to get into here. But it really displays the interconnected nature of not just philosophy, but of perspective. You can start to think that you understand what it means what a concept means. But then when you really start digging into the minutia, just like me looking at a part at work and trying to determine if the defect is too big or too small, trying to determine if the Neanderthals really did die out is not as clear cut as it appears,
No. I mean, to boil it all down, the perception is the act of, let's say, seeing or hearing, or apply what sense you will. So I see a glass. It has liquid in it. I determine that the glass is cylindrical. These are all percepts. They're called percepts, right? The liquid inside is vaguely green. All right. So that's perception. Perspective is what tells us that we think it's half full or half empty. We see the glass in perception. We see liquid in the glass. Our perspective puts a judgmental evaluation on what it is we're seeing.
Right. So, why do you think it is that perspective can change our reality. And we talked about this in the first time we recorded the episode. I don't think we talked about most of this stuff the first time we recorded.
I don't think so.
It's all new, which, I mean, it makes me want to do a bunch of episodes again, because I always think about it like, yeah, we did that episode on education, but there's a lot more to talk about. Or we did that episode on consciousness, but there's more to talk about. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm sure at some point in time we'll revisit all of these. But yeah, this is kind of proof in the pudding that we can talk about the same thing again and not really touch a whole lot of the same things. But this is one of them. We talked about it the first time around. Why can perspective change our reality? And two examples specifically are the placebo effect and nostalgia warming, which are scientifically observed things where, if somebody's cold and you get them to have nostalgic feelings, their physical body temperature will raise.
Okay.
So it's not in their head. It's something that actually happens. They actually get warmer. Mm-hmm. The placebo effect, right? If you give two groups of people pills, or you have three groups. A control group doesn't get anything, a group that gets a pill that has nothing in it, and a group that gets a pill that has an effect in it. It's pretty, consistently what happens is the control group, nothing happens. Your experimental group will have some kind of effect. And a placebo group will also have some kind of effect. Not as strong as the experimental group, but usually, just as often as not, something happens with the placebo group versus the control group, even though they're both technically not receiving anything. Why do you think that is? How do you think that happens?
Well, I think the how may be simpler than the why. I don't know, because I'm not an anatomical master. But to think about the physical responses that the mind can generate, we're back to the mind-body problem. We won't even go there again, except to say that there it is again. How does it happen? Well, if we can isolate that the body, upon a certain stimulus, releases certain energy in order to warm the body, we describe the process. Why it happens is perhaps less explicable from my viewpoint, but it's certainly extraordinarily useful to have happen. People do similar things with studies of prayer, and one doesn't have to be a person of religiosity in order to examine this. That somehow, if one is applying a focused meditation or focusing thoughts upon a person, and a person knows that there are people focusing thoughts upon them, then that generates a kind of energy for that person. Well, I don't think it needs to be spiritually mysterious at all to say that, yeah, if I know suddenly a lot of people are concerned about me, it may make me want to try to function a little bit better. And so, but what the question is really is this is perspective changing our lives, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course it does, because if we are convinced that nothing good is ever going to happen again, for instance, we just get into the slough of despond, and we say it's all over, it's done, close the pub on the world, then our perspective is one of saying, I can't see any way out of this, therefore a way doesn't exist. But if somebody tells me I may have been given a way out of something, it's possible, then my mind is saying, okay, believe that it's happening, and perhaps it will. I mean, how many sports, I've heard this for decades, the idea of see yourself sinking the basket and you will. Well, right. Yeah, that's rather like Yoda talking to Luke Skywalker, too. Maybe it will, and maybe not, but it has a chance.
And that's a fascinating thing about people, right? Is we are notoriously bad at calculating odds. And we're always thinking, well, I guess not always. Sometimes, like you said, people think that something's hopeless when it's not. It's, you actually could find a way out. And other times, the odds are almost impossible, but people just have a confidence that something is going to work out. And, how that perspective ends up actually changing what's happening is interesting. Because, in some ways, it makes you wonder, is it all biochemical messengers? Is it just you releasing different hormones in your brain and that's causing you to get warmer or to have some sort of positive physiological response to your thoughts?
Yeah.
Or what does it work? Is it a cultural or a social thing? Like you said, if you know that the group is pulling for you, and you feel like you have a valid, important place in it, does merely having those thoughts make you want to push through and serve as your part, or what makes this happen? And it raises the question. When you see these things play out in real life, it makes you wonder, do truth and reality really exist? It comes back to the question we asked at the beginning of the show. Is there an objective truth and reality, and we're seeing parts of it? Or is truth and reality different depending on your perspective?
Yes, I think that one is inclined to separate those things, unless you say something like this. So this is how some parts of philosophy work. People talk about whether or not the object actually exists, and there are cartoons about this. Okay, let me show you that it exists. I'll pick up the stone. I don't know if that stone exists or not. I pick up the stone, I toss it at your foot. I think it does. Yeah, and so there's a reality. Not transferable, but a transactional in some ways reality. We do encounter objects. Now, there's still some philosophers who would say, no, we're making that up. We're doing that. But for me, it's more of the hard and fast. Yes, I can touch a table. I know that table is molecularly particulate. I know that the reason my hand stops, I know because the scientists make this abundantly clear, that the adherence among all the particles, the atoms, with the electromagnetic fields, make it impossible for me to pass my hand through just by touching it. And yet, it is a collection of atoms. So seemingly, I ought to be able to just pass my hand through, like the Vision walking through a wall in the Marvel comics. But there's still a tangible reality. My finger touches the table. I can feel it. I am of the school that says, yes, therefore that exists. I have perceived it. Independently, it exists out there. I have encountered it. That's where I am. But that's not where
it's kind of triangulation of the truth, sort of, where we have this perspective, right? We're proceeding, like you said, the table. The table to us appears to be solid because of how we perceive it. Yeah. But if you perceive it with different instruments, it becomes very different. And I remember they did this at summer camp one year, right? Where you take like a beach ball and they set it down, and then they walk like 200 feet away and they put down a dodgeball and they say, all right, this is the scale of an atom. That's the nucleus, and here are the electrons out here. This is to scale. And you're like, well, if that's to scale and that's an atom, and everything's made up of atoms, and these things on the outside are spinning and they never touch each other, that's so much space. How can anything be dense enough to be solid, And this is a question that, it doesn't just blow the mind of an 8-year-old at summer camp. It blows the mind of the smartest people in the world when you get to the level of, classical physics versus quantum physics. And we still can't make them work together. Mm-hmm. And, and you start looking at things below the atom, below our instruments, where you say, okay, we have atoms, and then we have quarks, and then below that we have, I don't know, strange matter. It's like we don't know how reality works, and the best we can do is take measurements or look at it from the perspectives that we have, and then even if they don't match up, we can maybe sort of box it in. We can say, okay, well, if I'm looking this way, and this way, where does that Venn diagram intersect? And, what's in there? Based off of what we know, that must be true or reality. But it always leaves the question that if you have better instruments or you have different instruments developed, does it make it, what are those going to read? And is it going to shrink that intersection, or is it going to expand it? And, the history of science sort of demonstrates that you're going to get both.
Yes.
At some point, you're going to shrink it down and you're going to think that you have it. And then all of a sudden you're going to come up with something new and it's going to blow up the entire paradigm.
Yeah. But there's still a reality. It's just a reality that is broader or narrower than we thought. So the sum total of reality, as we talk about with the AI being able to perceive everything at once, hasn't changed, but our ability to see it again has changed. There's that perspective. I always go back to this play, The Lion in Winter. It was an Oscar-winning movie in the late 1960s. It was based on a play. It's about King Henry and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and it is probably the most delightful excursion into psychological, political, family dynamics that I've ever encountered. But there's a place in which the king has 3 sons. Only one of them can be king. All of them are plotting against the king. He wants them to plot against him because that's what kings will do to become kings. But he's locked him in the dungeon. And he's thinking he's going to have to kill all 3 of his sons and then father another child to start all over again. And there is the stoic, poetic, brave Richard Lionheart is that character. There's Geoffrey, who's just very mechanistic about everything, and the brothers are their brothers are in the, and then there's John, who's just witless, and the brothers are in this dungeon, and they hear the father coming, and stalwart Richard says, he's here. He'll get no satisfaction out of us. Don't let him see you beg. Take it like a man. Just, let Dad kill us. And Geoffrey says, you fool, as if the way one falls down matters. And Richard said, when the fall is all there's left, it matters a great deal.
Wow.
So, there's perspective in a nutshell. The reality is Dad's coming to kill us. The perspective is how we die.
Right.
Or does it matter how we die?
Yeah, and that's a question. I mean, that informs a lot of human actions and a lot of human thoughts. And every once in a while, some form of art really hits on that poignantly, and the moment it happens. The one that sticks out to me is in Interstellar, where Matt Damon's character attempts to kill Matthew McConaughey's. And so he cracks open his visor and he's losing the atmosphere into the space. And, Matt Damon's character, expresses sympathy for him and then says, I can't watch you die. I got to leave. And he takes a couple steps away and then he turns around and he says, they say that the last thing you see before you die is the face of your children. Do you see your children's faces? And then as this guy's just gasping and trying to find, and something about that, I watched that and I was like, wow, that's really powerful because here's one guy who's having this deeply philosophical moment. And then here's another guy just primally struggling to survive. Mm-hmm. But there's a very good chance that they both might be experiencing that same perspective at the same time. And that gives you just this insight into the complexity of humanity, right? This animalistic striving to survive, and then this coldly analytical thought about what survival means, and what drives it, and that sort of thing. So, yeah, and I had a lot of other stuff for this episode that I had from the notes from the old episode. But I don't think we'll get into it for time's sake. We might end up doing another one down the road. But
all right.
I think that this has been a good conversation so far. So
I very much enjoyed it.
All right, we'll get back into it another time. Until next time, keep on.